So,
Yeah, switch off my video.
all right. Welcome everyone. We are very happy to have Vidhya Soundarajan from Bangalore come to give a talk on import competition, formalization, and the role of contract labor. So, talk is for 75 minutes. Please feel free to interrupt and unmute yourself to ask questions. We will have 10 minutes at the end for people who want to ask further questions. All right, Vidhya, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Kanishka. Thank you, Abhirup, for the invitations. So I wanted to just start off by the motivation for this work. Essentially, it comes from the fact that we see a huge, a large share of employment, particularly in developing countries, coming from the informal enterprises. And this is synonymous with informal employment being large is synonymous with a low growth, low productivity due to a number of reasons, including misallocation or poor fiscal capacity due to poor tax collection because the informal sector typically doesn't pay taxes. So this being the problem, I just want to first characterize what stylized facts are between the formal and the informal sector, and then delve into the issue coming out of this. So the formal sector is typically comprises of registered firms under the purview of the government, and the informal sector is comprised of unregistered firms that are not a part of the government purview. So formal sector has higher regulatory costs and they pay taxes, while the informal sector has lower regulatory costs and typically don't pay taxes, at least in the formal sense. And the most important of all, and this is a stylized fact that's documented across many countries, is that the formal sector has higher productivity compared to the informal sector. And the productivity differences could be large in particular contexts. It could be small, depending on how the work composition is and worker composition, etc., across these two different sectors. So, having said this, what we do know is if there's a reallocation of resources from the informal to the formal sector, this is going to promote development and increase aggregate productivity for a number of reasons. And this is an important policy question. For this reason, formalization as in general is an important policy question. A number of different policy options have been considered. For example, can we reduce the barriers for firm to register to become formal? Or can we provide capital grants to small firms to help them grow? Can we dismantle size-based policies, for example, which incentivize firms to remain small? All this to say that there is a big picture view for the fact that formal sector is important, and academicians and policymakers have considered many options, and these give mixed results. Some are positive, some are negative, but the idea is big. That's what I wanted to convey here. But what we're focusing on today is about the role of international trade in promoting formalization. And why is this important? Because a number of developing countries have increased the participation in international trade considerably in the last decade or two, and hence is that trade induced competition changing the informal formal mix in the economy? That's a big question to ask. And there are a number of studies that have been studying this, looking at this. But what's interesting is that the effect of import competition on formality is ambiguous, and most studies find null effects, but some do find economically small positive effects on informality. And there's only one study that I can sort of cite with confidence that shows a very strong positive effect on informality, and that's in Brazil. And in fact, there's no study that looks at that shows that there is a negative effect on informality, or rather a positive effect on formality. So most of the studies are showing null effects, and there's a small sort of bias, or rather there's a tilt towards showing that import competition is actually increasing informality, if not anything. So why would one see such mixed effects? Why are these possibly ambiguous? It's because there are multiple pathways that govern the relationship between import competition and the informal formal composition. The first pathway, if you think about it, is essentially formal firms now facing competition from outside, and now they want to cut cost. And in order to be able to compete, and they're moving resources into the informal sector. This can be done by outsourcing, pushing workers to the informal sector, and so on. Right? This channel is going to increase the share of formal workers in the economy, or formal sector firms, formal sector workers in the economy. But if you look at the second channel here, if resources are reallocated from the informal to formal firms because of competition, then that's going to increase the uh, formal share of workers in the economy. And how might that happen? It might happen if the informal firms are directly facing the competition from imports, and they die because of the intense competition, and especially because they have lower productivity compared to formal firms, and the resources they hold, the workers they held, are now being reallocated to the formal sector. And of course, so long as the formal sector can reabsorb them, this reallocation can take place. And this second channel is going to increase the formal share of employment, formal sector share of employment in the economy. Might very well be the case that both channels are in play, and we might sort of end up seeing both, and hence the overall result is going to be an empirical question. So again, this is to just say that there's no surprise that there are mixed results, but we are going to see a particular context in the Indian setting and understand why the result we see is coming from this context with the help of this framework. That there are possibly two channels, and what we observe can be rationalized through one of these at least.
Vidya,
Uh,
there is also the issue of exit, right? Which is that the formal sector will always find it in the face of competition harder to exit given the kind of rules we have as compared to informal sectors, which may just artificially raise the proportion of formality because just of the nature of the exit, right? So I mean, in these two kind of pathways, you seem to have excluded the typical kind of thing that the international literature deals with, which is essentially that firms, because of competition, need to exit the industry, and that changes the composition, the average productivity of those particular industries. Right? I mean, if you think about the old literature on impact of various kinds of import tariff and all that stuff, I mean, one of the challenges typically is to control for the sectoral composition, right? I mean, what kind of firms remain. So here it seems that it's a movement of formal resource. It's almost like there's an intermediate step that formal firms, when you say like move resources to informal sector, it's almost like they kind of step down to that next level. But I mean, then you don't consider the fact that they may directly move down to just exiting the industry.
right. And that's thinking about the context, totally agree with you on the first part that it is perhaps harder, not only in developing countries, but a number of developed countries as well, to exit the market. So, so in the first channel, they are moving resources to the informal sector in order to cut costs. But if they were easily be able to exit, they might. Uh, but this is considering the fact that they cannot. So this is typically what they might do. But for the informal firms, in the second channel, they are easily able to exit and let go of the workers because they're not registered to begin with. So that's why the second channel becomes very easy for the informal firms. The formal firms in the first channel could also do that, but they cannot easily do that, as you rightly pointed out. So that is not, at least in this framework, that's not coming out to be the most important channel. If they were able to exit, I think that's going to decrease the formal sector workers in the economy. But we don't empirically see it. But even in terms of the framework, I think I'm not including that because that's not typically how formal sector regulatory framework works, as you say.
Right, right, right. And we should think always about the firms as being kind of the same product, where two different kind, because there could be vertical integration where the final product firms are largely formal sector, but the upstream firms are mostly informal, which is typically, I mean, it does happen in India, right? That
Right.
the input suppliers are all kind of informal, in which case the formality at the final output would also have an induced demand, I mean, induced impact on the informality.
Right. Yeah, that's captured in the first pathway, in the sense if there is a vertical link, and if the formal firm is affected in some way, it is going to pass on that demand shock or competition shock downstream to the informal firm. So you might see that as an increase in outsourcing, or it might, if the formal firms are very adversely affected, then they may not even be able to operate, so they may not do the outsourcing at all to begin with. So that's captured in the first channel as well. Yeah, and so, and there are studies that sort of look at this. There's some evidence that trade is increasing outsourcing in order to cut cost. That's precisely happening for the very reason that there could be vertical linkages between informal and formal.
I see.
So right, so the point here is, one, certainly might happen, but two, also can happen, and depending on how things play out, the second one can dominate if, for example, informal sector firms are directly competing with the products from the imported goods, and that could basically turn around the informal economy entirely. And there are a lot of people who may have lost jobs, who now are ready to be absorbed in the formal sector if the formal sector is thriving. So that's again an empirical question.
So just one minute, Vidya, one question. So the Goldberg Khandelwal kind of analysis basically points out that there is a lot of stuff happening at the input markets, right? I mean, the input market is where you see all the action in at least for some time in trade. I'm wondering, is the input market largely formal or informal in India?
I think
Suppliers,
that,
parts,
right,
and so forth. Yeah.
right. So it is, so we, in fact, if you want to talk about this analysis, we do take into account that when we talk about the trade effects. So of course, the main question we have is on product market, import competition, and what firms do. But the input side of things are also important, as that paper points out. So we control, I mean, and it is very largely formal as well. So if it's, I believe that if it's not formal, it's probably not going to be documented as inputs, at least in the first pass. It might come through a formal a trader who imports it, and then maybe then it goes to the informal sector as a second pass. But then there is a huge amount of imported intermediate goods that are used in the Indian context, and that paper, I think, shows that there are huge productivity effects from that. Yes, so we account for that and control for that channel, essentially, to sort of say that maybe there are positive effects on employment due to that, and we sort of take that into account. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. So the question essentially is very simple. Following from the pathways I described, we are looking at the effects of import competition on labor allocation between informal and formal sector enterprises. And please note that the definition of formality we use is employer-based, following Natrash 2011, McCaig and Pavnik, and a lot of other papers that study similar frameworks in trade. Essentially, the idea is to look at the allocation of work between different sectors, the formal sector and the informal sector. The idea being the productivity is different, many characteristics are different. Is trade enabling movement of resources from one sector to the other? And the reason I'm issuing this clarification now is because there's multiple definitions of informality. Formality could be worker-based, but we are following this strict employer-based. If a worker is working under an informal enterprise, we're calling that worker an informal sector worker. And if the worker is working in the formal enterprise, we're calling that worker a formal sector worker. So that's the definition we're following. And the context is Indian manufacturing between 1998, 99, and 2006-7. We're also we are answering this question using multiple data sets and using multiple levels of analysis. For example, using the worker level data from the National Sample Survey's Employment Survey, and also from the establishment level, using both the formal sector ASI and the informal sector NSS, Unorganized Sector Survey. So that's something we sort of try to do holistically to see whether the question is giving us similar results from multiple data sets and multiple levels. the identification, and I'm just going to talk about very briefly here, and I'll come back to it when I talk about empirical strategy. The identification is following the plausibly exogenous changes in Chinese imports at the 4-digit industry level. The idea being that imports coming into India, Chinese imports coming into India, are driven by China's own productivity enhancing measures like special economic zones or foreign direct investment that they followed, and not necessarily due to a particular country, and in this case, India, driving or demanding those inputs in that particular industry or that particular good. So that's the broad idea, and there's a huge literature on this. The China shock is very well established in that sense as being exogenous, but we also, again, following the literature, use an instrumental variable for addressing any remaining endogeneity issues, which is Chinese imports into India in that industry is instrumental with Chinese imports to a set of other developing countries for the same industry, same year. This again is has to follow the two criteria for the instrument, which is the exclusion and the relevance criteria. We are sort of obviously able to test the relevance criteria, but for the exclusion criteria to hold, some conditions have to be satisfied. So we will talk about how we choose these countries in order for those conditions to be satisfied when I explain the empirical strategy more deeply. So this is essentially what the paper is doing, using the China shock as the exogenous shock. So in terms of main findings, we have 3 different findings. The first thing, of course, answers the question I posed directly, which is, does import competition affect formal informal employment share in the industry? What we find is that a higher Chinese import competition in an industry is inducing a higher employment share in formal enterprises. So essentially, there is a higher formal share in the total industry's employment when that industry is facing higher Chinese imports. And where is this higher formal share coming from? We can, of course, disentangle the 2 aspects of it. One, is there truly an absolute increase in formal sector enterprise employment? Yes. So we find that formal sector enterprise employment alone increases, and informal sector enterprise employment alone decreases. Simultaneously, we see that formal increases and informal decreases, and that explains the increase in the formal share. Of course, this is at the aggregate level. At the industry level, this suggests reallocation of employment in an aggregate sense from informal to formal sector enterprises. And where does this increase in formal sector employment come from? Do all formal sector firms face an increase in employment? No, it is the top half of the productivity distribution. So the highest productivity firms that are actually absorbing this labor that's coming out of the informal sector. So that's the first set of results, and this is consistent with the second channel I talked about in terms of reallocation between from the informal to the formal sector, driving an increase in the formal share of employment. And this is possible when the informal firms are adversely affected or directly competing with the incoming imports, and then they have to quit the market, and the workers have to first remain unemployed for them to get reabsorbed into the formal sector. So we see consistently a lot of anecdotal evidence on this in the early 2000s. There's a lot of number of small, medium firms were hurt by the increased imports of Chinese goods in this period, which is essentially consistent with the findings we see here. So what is the contribution from this finding? To the best of our knowledge, most of the studies, as I indicated earlier, are talking about increased import competition having no effect, and a few of them that do talk about increased informality. So this is the first paper, to the best of our knowledge, is documenting a rather surprising result in terms of increased formal share of employment due to competition. We attribute this result to 2 things. One is the unique context where Chinese imports are directly competing with the informal sector firms, for which we have anecdotal evidence. and thus enabling this reallocation, or thus starting off this reallocation to happen. And second, and this might be underappreciated, is that there's unique data available on formal enterprise, and that's not surprising, but informal enterprise surveys in India in a rather consistent, regular intervals, and also that's nationally representative. So we did a brief survey of many other countries, and then we think that at least the conclusion we drew was India had a very good set of surveys, which gives us a good picture of overall formal sector enterprise data, and that's enabling us to do the study. And perhaps it's not been able to, perhaps in other countries it's not been able to be done. So that's the second reason why we are able to sort of do this study and find this result. Um, Second set of findings is that now that we've seen that there is this reallocation, there is an increased share of formal sector employment due to competition. We also find that this is dominated by an increase in contract labor. So what labor is getting reallocated and absorbed in the formal sector is mostly predominantly getting absorbed in the form of contract labor. So there is a rise in regular labor as well, pointing to the fact that broadly the firms are growing. So it's not that it's only contract. Generally, the firms are growing as well, but predominantly it's contract. And this speaks to the fact that contract labor does not carry firing costs and are cheaper on average than regular workers. And generally, the heterogeneity analysis we did points out to the fact that higher contract share is observed in pro-worker states defined by the Wesley-Burgess Index, and it's also observed in highly unionized states. So the idea here being these stringent labor regulations, or states in which there are these stringent labor regulations, they are able to reallocate, but only with availability of contract labor easing the reallocation situation. If it weren't for the fact that contract labor was possibly not available, maybe it have been hard for these states to reallocate labor. So
Can you give me an idea of, in terms of the welfare, what's the how much difference there is between contract employment and informal employment?
yeah,
I mean, given that these contracts have very little tenure, what do they mean in terms of? So, should I be excited to know that a bunch of informally employed people have suddenly started working for a formal firm, but under contract labor, which is not great employment also? So, I'm just
yeah,
wondering whether.
yeah. I have so definitely true that informal workers. I mean, there's a lot of job insecurity for contract labor, but from an anecdotal point of view, it might seem that contract labor is uh, facing a lot of issues, and we see that anecdotally in through a lot of news stories, media stories. But legally, at least, what I'm seeing is that there is absolutely no coverage of any legal means for informal work. But for contract labor, there is some legal coverage. Contract Labor Act of 1970 is going to provide for welfare amenities. And again, this is on average, but there is a wage gap between contract labor and informal enterprise worker as well. It's not huge. Regular labor regular wage is much higher, but we do see some wage gap between contract and informal employment. And if you look at the number of workers getting some benefit, the ASI is not great with this data, and neither is the NSS Enterprise Survey. We see that with the sparse data we have, there are many contract workers who are getting some sort of benefit through intermediary, the contractor firms. Like, for example, there are not a lot of big ones in manufacturing, but if you think about uh, quests or the many of these contracting intermediary firms, they are now increasingly providing team leads, for example. They're increasingly providing some benefits for contract labor. So that possibly is a short answer I can give, but definitely when we talk about wage increases, there is a wage increase that we see. I'll come to that when I talk about it. But your point is totally valid. In terms of job insecurity, there's absolutely nothing we can talk in terms of the gains. But broadly, wage and benefits, there is some gain that we see, at least from data.
Thank you.
So here, in terms of contract labor enabling this reallocation, we relate to this literature, this papers in micro and macro. In terms of labor institutions or stringent firing laws impeding employment adjustment to economic shocks. So there's a demand shock. Can a firm easily adjust to hire labor or fire them? That's going to be hard when there are stringent labor regulations. But institutions like contract labor is enabling these adjustments and reallocation in response to economic shock. And there's evidence of that in the US and in India, Auto 2003 and Chore 2015. And broadly, what this points out to is certainly worker welfare in terms of wages is going up at least. But in terms of firms' resilience, there's evidence from other studies that show that contract labor has improved formal sector resilience in terms of coping up with demand changes, demand shocks, and other kinds of adversities. So that's broadly consistent with Bertrand et al. 2015, who show that. So this is the last finding. It's not really a finding, but a deduction from what we find, and it answers to the question of so what. In the sense, so what if there's reallocation from informal to formal sector? What do we gain? So there is, we use a development accounting framework, which basically looks at the informal formal productivity gap and looks at how many workers have reallocated, the share of workers have reallocated from the informal to formal sector. And that with the productivity gap, they're able to quantify the aggregate labor productivity gain. And using that, we find that the aggregate labor productivity gain in the economy is 2.67%. There's also a wage gain by similar method one can do of about 0.77%, only for the workers, of course, who transition from the informal to formal sector. So this is the broad, if you want to quantify and ask what is the gain from this reallocation due to input competition, this is what we find. And of course, there's laws, employment laws in the manufacturing sector, and we'll show results on that because this was an adverse shock. The workers, especially in the informal sector, there's a lot of employment laws, but some got reabsorbed into the formal sector, as we saw in terms of reallocation, but some remained unemployed. They could have possibly been absorbed in other sectors, non-manufacturing sectors, but that's outside of the purview of this paper. But we do have some preliminary evidence that maybe they got absorbed into agriculture, but we don't have very highly statistically significant results of that, but the magnitudes are pretty large. So hence we're not able to put a number to what employment loss, quote unquote, could be, but at least we see that not everybody who's lost employment is reallocated into the formal sector. So some at least remain unemployed in the manufacturing sector's point of view. So that's what is the contribution here? The misallocation literature is very clear that low productivity is due to misallocation. And what we show here is that import competition is reducing this misallocation and leading to productivity gains. Sorry, there was supposed to be an arrow there, but yeah. So import competition is enabling productivity gains and reducing misallocation. So this speaks to this broad literature that even though there could be misallocation, reforms and competition and similar such policies could reduce misallocation. And finally, we contribute to this literature on estimating productivity gains itself. And this is the development accounting framework that I talked about. And as I said earlier, first, what is determined in how we quantify aggregate productivity gains is to first understand what is the productivity gap between formal and informal sector. It could be the case that formal sector is twice as productive than in the formal sector. It could be the case that it's 3 times as productive, 4 times as productive than the informal sector. Once we determine that gap accurately, then we can say that, okay, so many workers reallocated, so this is the total aggregate productivity gain that happened. So what is important is that in order to accurately determine that gap, how many times is formal sector more productive, often in the literature currently, what is used is a revenue productivity gap. And it's very well known that revenue productivity gap is conflating price and productivity, physical productivity difference. So, so one of the contributions we do is to account for this. We remove the price differences between the informal and formal sector, and we only are able to look at physical productivity differences between the informal and formal sector and give a modest number for this ratio as to what the productivity gap is, and are able to more accurately quantify these gains. And again, this is attributed to the really good data, I've said this many times, on informal sector firms in India, where we can actually get product-wise quantity sales information, which enables us to delineate quantity separately from price. So we're able to adjust this and then get a better productivity gap ratio. So that's the last contribution. And I'm going to talk about the empirical strategy a little bit more in detail. If there are questions about the broad, I think I can take it now. Okay, so as I said before, there are endogeneity issues in looking at the effect of competition on employment. And this is a skeleton regression where we're looking at IMP, which is imports in industry J at time T, and how that's affecting employment in industry J time T. Now, the problem typically that we see in this type of regression is that there could be endogeneity issues due to unobserved technology shocks or demand shocks. For example, if a particular industry in India is suddenly facing better technology, then they may start importing more goods, for example, and the same industry might also increase employment, witness an increase in employment for the fact that technology changed and it is now requiring more labor, for instance. So then the unobserved technology shock is going to bias my estimates. Ideally, we should be able to control for these shocks, but but what we have here is a measure of imports that is not correlated with these shocks, and that's why we go for the Chinese imports. So Chinese imports, again, as I said, it's plausibly exogenous for the reasons because it's completely internally driven from China. So the idea is that China, due to the productivity enhancing measures, essentially produced a lot of cheap goods, and they flooded the world market. And it's not that the individual countries were able to particularly demand these goods, but they could not help but face these imported goods from China. So in that sense, it's a shock to the individual countries' production employment system setup. So that's the main motivation we are focusing on Chinese imports. So the other reason is that China imports are also sizable. So one is it's interesting and help us solve the endogeneity issue. Two, the Chinese imports are sizable in the sense that if you look at China import share to the total imports coming into different countries, we see that the India's curve is the black solid line. We see that Chinese import share in India has increased a lot, about 3% to 18%. And what we see also is that Chinese imports into many other countries has increased, but although the Indian graph is much steeper. So this speaks to the point I told earlier about how Chinese goods essentially flooded the entire world market with its goods, and the countries had no other option but to face this competition that's coming in. So this graph sort of attests that in a way. And this brings us to the final empirical strategy that we have, which is the instrumental variable approach. So as you recollect, the endogenous variable we're looking at is Chinese imports into India in industry J at time T. We're using an industry level variation. And the instrumental variable for this is Chinese imports to another set of countries in the same industry, same time. So here the idea is that since China is flooding the world with its cheap goods, for any particular industry, say textile, India importing textile, I mean, textile is not the level we're looking at. We're looking at much minute level, 4-digit industry. But just to give an example, so India importing textile will be correlated with a set of other countries, let's say in East Asia, also importing textiles. So, and that's plausible because China is just flooding the world market. And this is also testable. So this is a relevance condition. We can easily test whether Chinese imports coming into a particular industry at a time T is correlated with Chinese imports to the set of developing countries we're picking, uh, in attesting to the fact that the first stage is good. But in terms of the exclusion criterion, the countries we choose are important. If we choose countries that are very close to India and are often trade partners, very strong trade partners with India, we might be failing on the exclusion criterion. So we pick countries that are far and they're less likely to trade within India. Trade volumes are also very low, which is the Latin American countries. So that's basically, this basically forms the set of instruments that we use. We have imports coming from China into the set of Latin American countries in the same industry in the same time period as the instrument for Chinese imports into India. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of empirical strategy is what about other trade channels? We are looking at a very specific independent variable, Chinese imports into India. But what about other kinds of trade policies, other kinds of trade interactions that are going on in the same industry across the world or with India and other partners? So that's important to the extent that they're correlated with Chinese imports into India, and also to the extent that they affect employment. So for the policies part, we look at output tariff and input tariff. And for the next important thing is, of course, the imported intermediate inputs, the Goldberg et al. Paper, which talks about the importance of inputs, cheap intermediate inputs available due to trade exposure on the effects on the firm at the firm level. So it's important to control for that. It might, for example, have a positive effect on employment for all industries specifically. So that's something that we control for. And what about other country imports into India? For example, other high and middle and low income countries that could be correlated with Chinese imports. So we control for that. And there's also the export market competition angle, where if China is exporting to EU, it could hinder or it could pose a competition to India's export to the EU, for example. So that must be controlled for. So we control for China exports to all other countries. And finally, we pointed out that Indian exports to the Latin American countries are very small. India's trade with those countries is very small, but we still account for exports to those countries. I have described the data sets before, so I'm just going to skip this part. And finally, the import competition measure, before we talk about the results, is something that I think I want to just take a minute on, because we'll be using the same measure for all the slides I present. So this is very simple. In the numerator, to recollect, this is at the industry time level. So the numerator, we have total imports of Chinese, total import value of Chinese goods coming into that industry at that particular time. In the denominator, we essentially have the size of the industry measured by production plus imports minus exports in an earlier time period, 1994. So this is essentially a normalized imported value from China, normalized by the production, by the size in 1994. So it's not a share, but it's a normalized imports. Sorry. So that's a measure of import competition and industry G and time T. So now I'm just going to talk about the organization of the results before I move into the results itself. So here we have results from multiple different types of data, as I initially said. We have results from the worker level surveys. We have results from the enterprise surveys. Then we talk about heterogeneity with respect to labor institutions. And finally, we zoom into the formal sector and look at what's happening within the formal sector. Which are the firms that are growing in the formal sector, for instance?
Vidhya, I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you consider looking at, other than employment, maybe the fact that you could shift to an alternate, but maybe close substitute industry that is not facing competition, or is this kind of a ridiculous question to ask? I don't know.
No, that's a great question. I think no, we've not looked at that actually, but that's a great question. I think there's some evidence for for whether firms switch products. I think it's not been at least studied in the Indian context in terms of China, but there is evidence in the broad literature that the firms could switch products. So we're not studying that, but I guess what we're looking at is broadly an equilibrium effect of they might have done that as an adjustment to inputs coming in, but even if they were able to adjust, whether they were not able to adjust, what is the final outcome? So my guess is that informal firms can't do that very easily, but maybe the formal firms could do, and that's why they survived. That, as the result shows. So sort of the question you're asking is sort of internalized in what we see in the employment results is what I think the answer could be.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so so here I'm going to talk about the regression specification followed by the results, because for each different data sets, I have a different regression specification. So we'll start with the worker level survey. So this is using the NS's unemployment employment round for 2 years, 1999, 2000, and 2004-5. Of course, this is a cross section. And the main independent variable is IMP, lagged with 1 period, the one I just described. And the outcome variable is defined at, for person I, industry J, state S, and time T. And the outcome variable is a binary variable which takes the value 1 if the worker is employed by a formal firm and 0 otherwise. And how do we identify whether the worker is in a formal firm from this survey? The NSS collects data on the number of workers, the electricity availability, and enterprise type. It asks the worker what kind of employer you have and collects these data. So from this, and applying the Factories Act definition, which talks about the worker threshold, we're able to determine whether the worker is in the formal sector or in the informal sector. So sometimes what happened was that based on the worker level threshold, the worker could have been classified as unregistered, but they may state that they are working for a registered firm. In that case, we sort of overruled the size-based definition with the direct employment registration-based definition, because some small firms could also have been registered. So that's the data we use, and that's how we classify whether the worker is working in the informal sector or the formal sector. That's the outcome variable. In terms of the controls, we have an exhaustive set of fixed effects: industry year, state year, and state industry. And Z describes the alternative trade channels I described, all of them. And since we don't have a panel, we can't control for worker fixed effects, but we can control for a number of different characteristics: age, gender, education, social group, religion, marital status, and residence. So these are the results. The outcome is an indicator for employment in formal enterprise, and we have only listed the coefficient of the main independent variable, which is Chinese imports. So the first 3 columns are for OLS, and the last 3 is for IV. We have a pretty strong first stage, as indicated by the F statistic, and the preferred specification we're looking at is column 6, where all the fixed effects and the controls are there, and where the worker characteristics are also interacted with the binary variable for the year 2004. So this is indicative very
just
strong.
a clarifying question.
Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, since your dependent variable is dichotomous, have you also explored using binary or binary model like a logit or probit model? And similarly, instead of using a 2-stage least squares, you could use a bivariate probit model for your IV specification.
Right. No, we have tried the probit, and that the results are consistent. Yeah, I've not reported here because often the preferred specification is the linear model, for interpreting, especially when you have a lot of fixed effects, which is why I didn't report probe it, but sure, it is consistent. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. The results indicate that higher import competition is increasing the probability that a worker is in the formal enterprise by 0.473, and we've run a number of robustness checks, and we've also done heterogeneity analysis to see what types of workers are moving. I can talk about it at this time, as in whether older workers are moving, more educated workers are relocating, and rural versus urban. So that's interesting, but I'm just going to skip that part, unfortunately. To the second part of the results, which uses a different data set.
With just one question. So when you're saying they're moving, essentially you are looking at two cross sections, right? And this is largely the cross section of wage labor, right? So how do you know that people are not moving from the self-employed, for example, into more into the formal sector? I mean, all you see is basically, people who are, because there is a large, other category which is essentially whether they are self-employed or not, and there'll be people moving out of, for example, small self-employment towards informal or formal employment, right? I mean,
Right.
it's not a formal and informal is not the is not does not exhaust the world. I mean, in fact, if in terms of wage labor, it's only a very small part of it.
Right. I have to double check, but this is the definition of formal we follow. That is, if workers report to be in the in working for a formal sector enterprise, they are classified as formal. And I do think that zero indicates all of the informal, which includes self-employed, because in the NSS you can identify self-employed, which we haven't done specifically, but looking at this definition, and I can certainly double check on this, but I think all of the zero refers to informal enterprise workers, which could be own account workers as well. If I have an informal firm and I'm a worker in that firm, that is counted as part of informal. Does that answer the question?
I see. Yes, I was just wondering whether, I mean, just thinking about the employment round, right? So there'll be a part on wage labor, on from which I guess wage labor will be asked what kind of enterprise they are in, and then I think the self-employed part is, I don't remember now. It's probably different, but anyway, I mean, if you're, I mean, the question is whether it's a movement. I mean, that's fine. It could be that it's already included. I'm just curious whether it's kind of a movement from informal wage employment towards formal wage employment, or is it a movement, a relatively differential movement from self-employed towards those two kinds of employment?
Right. No,
Because
that's a
it
great
would right
question.
now,
Yeah.
yeah?
Yeah. Sorry, you were saying?
I mean, just something I just thought. So
No, that's a great question, because we've been thinking of doing that too, whether this transition is coming from informal workers or own account workers. And in many, and I believe this definition includes both. The zero has the own account workers as well. And I'm thinking about the in the schedule, the part where wage employees are reported, and my as per my memory, that section is for those who report wages, but I believe those who report employment, and they basically talk about what type of employer they work in, and that's for all, and that's for everybody. So the last schedule in the NSS which reports wages is, I think, only for wage workers. But I can double check. But this is an interesting question in terms of delineating the two, which is
right,
something
right.
we've been thinking about as well. Yeah.
I meant in that terms only. I mean, I'm sure you included it. I mean,
Yeah. No, I think that is interesting, because yeah, who are the? I mean, it's interesting in terms of heterogeneity analysis. We can add to that, saying that is it the person who has their own firm that's sort of moving, or is it somebody working for a different firm that's moving?
yeah, but also because see, you don't have earnings for self-employed people, right? The NSS will never cover that. So, I mean, in some sense, when you're talking about the wages changing and so on and so forth, I mean, the only wages you can actually check are wages of, I mean, people in wage labor from the NSS, right? So you have lesser idea of what people were earning when they were self-employed. So, I mean, it's important to know then which margin people are moving, so you can then say whether this is actually welfare enhancing or not for people. I mean, the case of formality and informality stays. I mean, I know that your paper is about that, but in terms of the welfare calculation, that has a different implication.
Right, right. We do, of course, consider wage for wage workers. Absolutely. Great. Okay. Thanks for all the questions. I'm just moving on to the next part where we use the enterprise surveys and aggregate them at the state industry level. Here we are looking at the same independent variable, but the outcome variable is now four types. First is the share of workers in formal firms, and that's determined by when we combine ASI and NSS together and aggregate at the state industry level. That's essentially the first variable is essentially the share of ASI workers in the total workers in that industry. The second one is log workers in formal firms, and that's essentially the log of workers from ASI in that industry. And the third one is in ASI, what is the log of regular and what's the log of contract? And finally, log informal workers is in that industry, J, what is the number of workers in the NSS, which is the unorganized enterprise survey. So that's how we define the outcome variable. The main outcome is, again, we're looking at a share of workers in formal firms, whether import competition has increased or decreased the share of employment in formal firms. And what we find is reported in the table here. We have OLS and IV for panel A and panel B respectively. The outcome variables are in the top, where you can see in column 1, and I'm just looking at the IV results here, interpreting them here. So the increase in import competition is increasing the formal share of total employment, and that's pretty significant statistically. And as we mentioned earlier, the total employment is going down in the manufacturing sector. So there are employment losses. But how do we break that down into formal and informal? Column 3 is showing that there's a huge decline in informal employment, but there is an increase in formal employment, as you see in column 4. So this increase in share, as we said earlier, is share of formal is coming from both a decline in informal firm workers and an increase in formal firm workers. And in terms of formal firms, is it predominantly regular or is it predominantly contract? And you can see that from column 5 and 6. In terms of percentage change in employment, there's a huge percentage increase in contract labor compared to regular labor, but there's also an increase in regular labor among formal firms. So that's essentially sort of consistent with what we find in the worker level, from the worker level analysis. So what is encouraging is that we are able to sort of use two complete different sources of data collected from two different sources, workers versus firms, and able to sort of consistently establish that this formal share increase is observed in both cases. So here too, we do a number of robustness, and instead of state industry, we run the analysis at the industry level, and we obtain very similar results. So that's not really affecting the level of analysis, and level of aggregation is not affecting our results. So this is the third part about heterogeneity.
I have a quick question again. So I'm not very familiar with this literature, but my question is related to the specification in particular. So since you're using a log of employment, and it's well known that if you have heteroskedasticity in your logged model, in that case, there's typically a retransformation problem when you're trying to, go back to predicting the employment outcome. So in the presence of heteroskedasticity, even in your log model, it can cause problems when you're retransforming your log model to a say from log employment to employment. So I'm just curious, in your case, did you do any test for heteroscedasticity to see either in your original dependent, if employment was your dependent variable, either in that variable or your log of employment variable, was there any heteroscedasticity either in terms of a formal test or even graphically? Was there, I mean, I don't know if that is a concern, but just pointing out that there is a literature on this regarding the retransformation problem.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I haven't done employment regressions and then transformed log and done separate regressions, if that's specifically what you're asking. So maybe it's worthwhile checking absolute levels and what's happening to them. But this is purely percentage changes because that's how we're interpreting log outcomes. And to account for the fact that there could be heteroscedasticity and correlation within clusters, we also cluster the standard errors at the 4-digit level. So that's I mean, the assumption is that there is clustering and there is correlation and there is heteroscedasticity, and the standard errors take care of that because we cluster at that level, and we also do the white robust standard error estimation as a part of this.
Vidya, I think Saurabh's question will only be relevant if you were to, transform this to employment from this model. In terms of log of employment, your variable is completely correct. It's just when you do e to the power to get employment from the coefficient, you need what is called a smearing factor. But your interpretation here is not in terms of the log, but in terms of, I mean, not in terms of employment, but in terms of log of
But in terms
employment.
of the percentage.
Exactly, as you said, and you're interpreting this as a percentage change.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
if you're
Thank
not retransforming it to employment, then it's fine. That issue doesn't arise. So it's essentially in the retransformation. But yeah, so apparently in your case that wouldn't be an issue.
Yeah. So we are interpreting the percentages rather than going back and looking at the employment effect in absolute terms itself. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So this is now that we've looked at the worker level analysis and the enterprise level aggregated analysis, we are now looking at heterogeneity in terms of labor institutions. So the two labor institutions we're looking at is unionization and stringent labor laws, particularly firing laws. So you can see the first 4 columns are for the worker level surveys, which is using the binary variable we described. And the last 4 columns are using the aggregated enterprise survey using the formal share in total employment that we described. So columns 1, 2, 3, and 4 are respectively high unionization states, low unionization states, pro-worker states defined in the Wesley-Burgess index-based framework, and non-pro-worker state. And then that's repeated again in columns 5 to 8. So here what we see is that it's pretty stark in terms of magnitudes as well as significance, that an increase in import competition is affecting increasing formal sector share in highly unionized states as well as in pro-worker states. So this is interesting because this speaks to the fact that these states perhaps were the ones that have high misallocation to begin with, and which means high informality to begin with. And now when there's competition coming in, this informal firms shedding and these informal firms dying and workers getting reallocated to formal sector in a big way compared to the low unionization or non-pro-worker states. So this is pointing to the fact that misallocation being high in these particular contexts and competition coming in and the reallocation is happening in a majorly different way in these particular settings compared to those that are not facing this competition, these labor institutions. And what's even more interesting is that we see contract share increase in high unionization and pro-worker states. That is, this formalization is happening in these particular contexts, as we see. But what is enabling them is also the presence of contract labor as an institution, and who is getting absorbed into the the formal sector again is predominantly coming from these particular states which had stringent labor laws or high immunization to begin with. So that's speaking to this entire literature on labor institutions impeding reallocation in general, but contract labor enabling them broadly, contract labor type institutions enabling them broadly. Okay, so this is the last part of the regression results. Now we look at the formal sector, we zoom into the formal sector. We're not looking at informal sector in this analysis, but just the formal sector, how individual firms are behaving, and is there heterogeneity in response across the different productivity quartiles that we define. So the first equation is essentially the same that we described earlier, except now we have firm fixed effects because we have the ASI panel. And the second one is exactly the first equation, but now interacting the main independent variable with productivity quartile based on the initial labor productivity the first year that the firm appeared in the data. Right, so the results are here, and I hope you can see the numbers. Now, the first four columns are the overall effect, and the last four gives us a result by quartile. And we see that in the first column, there's an increase in total employment within firm. And this is sort of mirroring the result we saw earlier in terms of, yes, there is an informal sector employment, there is a formal sector employment increase, but we are seeing this at the level of the firm as well. And this is not observed for regular workers, it's observed for contract labor, and the share of contract labor at the firm level is going up, as you can see in columns 3 and 4. And columns 5 to 8 show that this increase in employment and contract ratio is coming from the largest two top quartiles. So if you look at the Q3 interaction and Q4 interaction, that's where the increase in total workers is coming from. In fact, there is a decline in the lowest quarter in employment as well as in contract labor and regular labor. But this effect entirely is coming from the largest quartile. So that's again pointing to the fact that there's reallocation perhaps happening even within the formal sector. So earlier we talked about reallocation in terms of formal versus informal, but this is pointing to the fact that there is some sort of a churning happening even within the formal sector, broadly pointing out to the theory that it is these broad productivity sort of segregations that are driving how firms respond to incoming competition.
Is there any evidence, Vidya, that the firms, the productive firms, are integrating their downstream work into their operations? Because you would get the very similar results, right? Earlier, if you were a productive firm but you were only producing the final product, and basically you were relying on some outside worker, I mean maybe for the informal firms, for your input. Now basically with time you integrate, maybe for productivity advantages. So I'm not doubting your productivity result, I'm just thinking of the mechanism that you basically integrate these guys, you give all the employees of these firms, these informal firms, you give them some contract job, right? And because you do it, because having the whole operation under one umbrella will raise productivity, right? So I'm just wondering whether you observe in terms of, for example, input suppliers. Do you observe that input, earlier people were buying inputs from outsiders, but now the amount of inputs you buy is lesser because you basically integrated that part into the firm itself? That could happen too, right? I mean, firms do that all the time, right? They integrate their suppliers as they grow, or maybe
Right.
just for productivity to survive.
Right. So I think that's one way of surviving. But I mean, of course, we haven't seen that. So that's a great question. We haven't seen that particularly, but I'm also thinking of maybe disintegrating and outsourcing as a way of surviving. Maybe you don't want to produce everything in the same umbrella because maybe you want to have you don't have economies of scope. Maybe you want to sort of specialize and redistribute production processes to more specialized vendors. So that's another possible way of
It
strategizing.
all depends on the transaction cost, pretty much, right? I
Right,
mean,
right.
that's what I'm saying. It's just it seems like an interesting kind of thing to explore, given the data would be there at the ASI level, right? In terms of inputs, whether inputs are coming from outside, how much are basically procured from within, or even if you look at outside and that kind of falls per unit, you can kind of figure out that maybe people are buying less from outside, so they must be producing more I mean, it
Internally.
helps kind of push the paper in. So right now I agree what you are saying can happen, but what I am saying can also happen. But I think the data is there to actually remove those two things and then point out what's the exact mechanism.
Right. So we are aware of a paper that looks at outsourcing increasing as a part of the Chinese import shock,
I see.
for instance. But then it could be the case that and hence vertical integration happening with some firms. But I don't know if that measures vertical integration in a way that you described, because in ASI, in fact, there is data on whether I procure from another firm a part of my inputs, but
Right.
I don't believe you can directly talk about vertical integration more than that.
Yeah,
But that's
that's
worth
I
checking.
mean, it's indicative,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So this is a balanced panel, right? So you must have, I mean, though I know exit is not that much, but I mean, ASI has its own idiosyncrasies. So do you lose firms from the base year, and do they largely belong to, one of these quartiles? I'm just thinking about, whether there's some attrition loss because of that.
No, it is not a balanced panel throughout the time period we're looking at.
I
Uh,
see.
so what we call as initial productivity is the first time the firm appears in the data.
I see.
We measure the productivity from that, and that
Okay.
could be in the very first year that we're studying, or it could be somewhere in the third or fourth, and they may last for a couple of years, but not throughout the data.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
also, right, and also the sample part of ASI is again a sample. The big firms are a census.
yeah.
The biggest firms are a census, but the ones that are below the size threshold of 100 or 200, it kept changing. But those are surveyed once in 3 years or something like that. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Just a follow-up point on the attrition, since you don't have a balanced panel in this case. So did you, take a look at the characteristics of the firms that exited? I mean, if you don't have a balanced panel and compared to the firms that you basically see, observe for the entire duration, I mean, did you consider whether attrition, non-random attrition could have been potential confounding source in your data?
No, yeah, that's a good question. We've not looked at it because of the very fact that the smaller firms or medium firms in the Indian context are not, we don't have a census of those firms. So they're sort of designed to not be a census. It's only a survey for those medium and small size firms, anyways. So we can't really observe attrition except for the biggest of firms. So that said, I think we're not able to do that analysis. But particularly for productivity estimation, we are basically looking at a smaller subset of balance panel. So that can be that's giving us consistent results. So we have done that.
Hmm.
But in
Yeah.
any case, it's
Yeah,
not
but
attrition, right? It's just,
sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, sorry. I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
No, no, go ahead. Yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah, that's
No,
fine.
I don't think it's just to kind of add to. I don't think it's attrition in the way, it's not that the firms are exiting. I think that what Vidya was saying is that because it's a survey, it's a sample. They're not sampled every period, so you have observations in some years and others. For firm fixed effect, this is a fixed effects estimator, right? So you must have at least two observations for each firm, right?
Yes.
At least. So there you have that. So the question
Yeah.
is, how many firms do you have only one observation, which would be in some sense the conventional attrition bias?
Right. Yeah. So I'm
Hmm.
sure there are many of those firms that get dropped out of this estimation. Is that's what you're referring to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I didn't actually realize that. I mean, this is not, firms dropping out due to various reasons, but that they were not sampled, right,
Exactly.
in the
Yeah.
follow-up
Yeah.
period. Okay, got
Yeah.
it. Yeah, nice.
Yeah, and that said, as Abhirup said, I think only firms that appear at least 2 times are in this regression results. because we'll be unable to use firm fixed rates otherwise.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So I don't know if I have much time, but can I talk a little bit about this, Kanishka?
Yeah. So we have about, easily 10 minutes more.
Great. So, okay, so here I'm just going to briefly talk about how productivity gains are characterized. So the idea here is that there is this reallocation of workers from informal to formal sector, but how do we quantify those gains, or how do we talk about those gains in terms of how many workers are being reallocated, and can that information give us any number on productivity, aggregate productivity gain as a result of that? So the way we think about this is very simple. So the change in labor productivity is essentially a share of workers who got reallocated from the informal to formal sector, or any sector you want to think about, agriculture to non-agriculture. So this is a basic framework. The share of workers who got reallocated multiplied by the change in productivity for these reallocated workers. How much are they gaining in terms of productivity because of this reallocation? And the latter, the former is easy to measure. It's essentially the coefficient from your regression. It's going to tell you what is this increase in share of workers from in the formal sector as a result of competition. But the latter is the change in productivity due to latter is the productivity gap, and that's based on the existing productivity gap between the formal and informal sector. So how do we measure that? And that's the challenging part, and that's what this section is about. So what we essentially do is follow the literature in terms of using a Cobb-Douglas framework with homogeneous labor and perfect competition. And there the result is well known, that wages are equal to marginal revenue product of labor, and that's equal to the elasticity of labor, elastic output with respect to labor multiplied by average revenue product of labor. Now, so this is for any sector S. So what we want to do, if you go back to the previous slide, is to look at what is this productivity gap or the change in productivity that can be caused due to reallocation for a single worker. So that is determined by the gap or the ratio between labor productivity in the formal and the informal sector. So if we just take this equation or this particular expression and write this for as a ratio for formal and informal, formal denoted by F and informal denoted by I, then we have WF by WI, the wage ratios, is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor ratios, and that's equal to the average revenue product labor ratio. And the last one is assuming that the output elasticity is constant across sectors. So we basically essentially use this expression to calculate labor productivity ratio, right? So how do we arrive at this labor productivity ratio? Firstly, we can just take a simple crude measure, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in terms of row A here. This is the unadjusted gap. So we have 14.22 as the ratio of revenue productivity in formal sector to the informal sector. So that's a huge unadjusted productivity gap is huge. And similarly for wage gap, we have 4.05. Right, so that's essentially basically doing WF by WI or ARPLF by ARPLI. Now the problems with this is very apparent, which is that this ratio could be muddled with a number of differences due to the underlying worker composition or the production systems in the formal and informal sector. So there could be differences in worker characteristics. For example, formal sector workers could be more educated. They might be putting in more hours compared to the informal sector. Or there could be measurement error. Informal sector output could be measured with more error than formal sector output. There could be difference in prices, which means that maybe the formal sector has differential prices, perhaps higher prices than the informal sector, or not. And finally, there could be differences in the production function itself in terms of the output elasticity of labor being different. So I'm not going to delve deep into how these were calculated, but what we do is first consider the unadjusted revenue productivity gap and the wage gap, and slowly start adjusting for these differences that I talked about in terms of formal and informal sector. So when we apply these different correction factors, we arrive at a more moderate and a more sort of modest estimate of the labor productivity gap. Uh, uh, some are calculated by us, some are from the literature, and we're finally able to come down to this number of 1.18 for revenue productivity gap and 1.21 for wage gap. And this is basically plugged into the first equation I showed you. And we are finally able to calculate the total gain from reallocation of workers from the informal to formal sector, having established an accurate, or rather modest, accurate estimate of labor productivity. So that's really what these last two rows are. What are the productivity gains based on number 5, 1.18, and what are the productivity gains based on 1.21 here, and that's 0.77. So this is the numbers are presented in the first set of slides when I talked about the motivation and the results. So this is how we quantify the gains in aggregate productivity. So this was a long exercise, and my co-author Rahul had done this part in calculating carefully what are the differences that need to be accounted for, what kind of ratios one need to adjust, and especially the difference in prices was essentially coming from, we had to do this at the product level because the informal sector data and the formal sector data at the in the ASI and NSS had information on product level prices and quantities, and we were able to apply that adjustment factor using data from product level and sort of aggregate and then apply this factor. So a lot of work has gone into doing this. It's very interesting, and the conclusion here would be essentially just to highlight the 3 contributions we make. The first is that as far as the knowledge goes, this is the first study to point out the role of import competition in formalizing the economy, in the sense of workers getting reallocated from the informal to formal sector, and contract labor enables this reallocation to happen because it's sort of able to circumvent a number of institutions that could have been an impediment in this reallocation happening. Importantly, there is short-run unemployment in manufacturing. Not every worker who is losing their job is able to reallocate and get absorbed in the formal sector. And finally, the price adjustment, the productivity gap ratio that we showed has not been done before, and this is the first study to do that. So we are able to arrive at a more modest estimate of the labor productivity gap because of this adjustment. So thanks, and I can take more questions.
Yeah, I have one question. So in this case, so there is a productivity gain on people who got employment by moving from informal to formal. But let's assume that, but as you said, right, there are many unemployment happened, and probably, you know, they might get, if they don't get any employment so easily, or they get employed in a low productive, let's say, agriculture sector. So you could still have a net productivity loss, assuming that, you know, if they all of them go to, let's say, very low productive sector, or they don't get a job. That's possible, right?
Yeah, so in manufacturing, so certainly some of the workers, as I said in the beginning, we do have preliminary evidence that who remained unemployed were, some of them did get absorbed into agriculture. So we did a district level analysis, and we were able to determine some of these intersectoral movements. But the idea of productivity gains in the way we quantify it is certainly within the manufacturing sector. So of course, for the much broader economy, the employment laws itself can be quantified, which we have not gone down into. But this is purely from the manufacturing point of view. Workers have reallocated from the informal to formal sector, and there is an aggregate productivity increase for those firms in the manufacturing sector. So that's really what we quantify.
Okay, so
And
even
we're not talking about this in the welfare sense of the entire economy for sure.
got it.
The productivity gains is for the manufacturing firms.
Okay, so yeah, for in manufacturing sector, but let's say even in that case, so assuming that those informal sector also had a heterogeneous worker, so some workers are very productive and some workers are not so productive, right? So that's the aggregate product, and the shift only happened to the people who were very productive, right? Or probably the jobs, special type of job which were a productive job. So would that not kind of overestimate the gain? So and all the people who were a less productive job or kind of less productive due to inherent characteristic, they didn't get absorbed. So wouldn't this analysis overestimate the productivity difference, if because there were a lot of unemployment as well?
Yeah, so the unemployment part is separate, but what you're saying is that there is heterogeneity within the informal sector. Am I reading that right?
Yes. So let's say if there were 100 workers in informal sector, 50 got absorbed, right? And the people who got absorbed were a high productivity to begin with, right? Because there was some heterogeneity on possible. I don't know. So that's what my question was. That until we know exactly what happened to the unemployed people or the people who lose employment, wouldn't we be overestimating the impact? That's my question.
Yeah, so the unemployment thing, of course, we're not quantifying, but in terms of your question about high productivity workers being absorbed, for instance, this is the heterogeneity at the worker level. So we see that mostly younger people are getting reabsorbed into the formal sector. And we see no big difference, at least significantly, in terms of education, but there's in fact, contrary to what we discussed, there is higher reallocation among the lower than primary and middle. So it's not the highly educated people are not moving, although the effects are significant. It's positive there. The results are mostly coming from the lower education category and from the urban category. So there is definitely heterogeneity into who's moving. Uh, but the productivity gains that we calculate is on average. On average, what is the broad productivity in the informal sector and what is the broad productivity in the formal sector, and that's just what is giving us. So certainly unemployment is something we are not able to quantify the welfare effects of, but this is essentially for those who reallocated. Whoever's reallocating, what are they doing to the firms? What's happening to the productivity once they move to the formal sector, and whoever's relocating, what is happening to the wages once to move to the formal sector? Both are growing, and that's really the part of the story.
Yeah, with the one more thing about this wage gains, actually, while you say it's modest, but actually, I think it's important to point out, I guess, that these are actually underestimates, because if you think about, that you're basically saying regular jobs, the contractual jobs are rising in the formal sector. If you know some of the literature on, for example, unionization and formal kind of workers, this is done under the assumption that you get perfectly competitive wages, right? I mean, that's the indicator of marginal product. But we know in models of unionization, where like formal worker unionization kind of models, you typically get something which is something slightly different, right? And you could be getting slightly more than your marginal product also. I mean, depending on your bargaining part, depends on the market. Actually, it depends on the factor input market. So and for contract workers, it could just be the competitive wage. So in that sense, then you are basically providing an underestimate, because because now your proportion of contract workers is rising, and essentially the people who can kind of control wages through unionization and so on and so forth, that's falling, right? So in the latter case, it's not it's basically all these overpaid guys are not getting overpaid anymore, right? So the initial lot was getting rather, yeah. So would it be an underestimate and overestimate? Let me just think. So you are inferring productivity from wages. So if they were getting more, yeah, then no, then it would go the other way. Actually, in fact, no. It's right. So it's the wage gain is the latter period minus the earlier period, right? And in the earlier period, people were just getting wages higher than their usual marginal product.
because they were all not contract, they were more regular.
Yeah,
Right.
they're more regular. So therefore, you're basically underestimating the wage gain. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. So to the extent we assume contract labor are not unionized, and maybe, I mean, so that would give us yeah. So if they are able to bargain, then the wages may go even further up.
Surely they will be able to bargain less than formal sector, formal employees, right?
Right. They are, yes. Is they are able to, they're not able to bargain as much as formal regular workers,
Right.
because
right.
they're typically not unionized.
Exactly.
And if they were able to do that, then the wage gain could be higher than what they're getting now.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, it's not like to like comparison. I mean, you have done this under the assumption that it's comparative wage all throughout, right? And
Right.
it may not be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we are almost out of time. So I just want to sort of formally conclude the seminar here. So thanks to the speakers, thanks to the participants for a very interesting talk.